The slap landed so hard that the entire dining room went silent. 1 second earlier, my family had been laughing over Thanksgiving dinner. The next, my sister's hand had struck my face so hard that my head snapped sideways. The fork slipped from my fingers and clattered against my plate. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then my father pointed toward the front door. "Get out." I slowly looked up. His face was red with anger. "You heard me," he said. "Get out of my house and don't ever come back." My mother stared down at her plate. My sister smirked. Outside, snow drifted across the driveway. The temperature had already dropped below freezing. I stood there for a moment, feeling the sting on my cheek. Then I nodded. I picked up my coat. I walked out into the cold. By sunrise the next morning, my father had lost the house. My mother had lost her car. My sister had lost the comfortable life she'd been living for years. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, my family was about to discover a truth they should have learned a very long time ago. Everything they thought belonged to them belonged to me. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how my family threw me out on Thanksgiving night and why they woke up the next morning with absolutely nothing. For most of my life, I was the invisible daughter. You probably know the type. Every family seems to have one. The child who solves problems. The child who pays bills. The child who quietly sacrifices. And somehow that child is usually the least appreciated. That was me. My older sister Rachel was the opposite. Rachel had always been the center of attention. Growing up, she could do no wrong. If she forgot a responsibility, somebody fixed it for her. If she made a bad decision, somebody rescued her. If she hurt someone, excuses appeared like magic. My parents called her spirited. Everyone else called her spoiled. I enlisted in the army when I was 20. At first I joined because I wanted purpose. Later I stayed because I discovered I was good at it. Over 18 years I deployed overseas, missed holidays, slept in tents, worked through storms, and spent birthdays on military bases thousands of miles from home. I climbed through the ranks one promotion at a time. Nothing was handed to me. Everything was earned. Meanwhile, Rachel drifted from one job to another. She quit when work became difficult. She borrowed money she never repaid. She treated responsibility like an annoying suggestion. Yet somehow she remained the favorite. For years I told myself it didn't matter. I had my career. I had my dignity. I had my own life. But there was one thing I never stopped doing: taking care of my family. When my parents nearly lost their home after my father made a disastrous investment 15 years earlier, I stepped in. I never told anyone outside the family exactly what happened. The neighbors assumed my parents had recovered financially. The truth was much simpler. I bought the house. Every document carried my name. Every mortgage payment came from my account. Every property tax bill. Every insurance payment. Every repair. The roof. The furnace. The plumbing. Me. All of it. But I never made a big announcement. I didn't want gratitude. I just wanted my parents to be safe. Eventually, I also purchased 2 vehicles, one for my father, one for my mother. The titles were in my name. The insurance policies were in my name. The maintenance plans were in my name. Again, I never mentioned it. I simply handed them the keys. Use them as long as you need. That was years ago. The arrangement became normal. Normal is dangerous. People stop seeing gifts as gifts. They start seeing them as rights. By the time this story began, my family had completely forgotten who was paying for everything. Or perhaps they never cared enough to notice. Thanksgiving arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon. I had driven 3 hours from Fort Liberty after finally securing a few days of leave. The house looked beautiful. Warm yellow lights glowed through the windows. The smell of turkey drifted through the air. For a moment standing on the porch, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe we could enjoy one peaceful holiday. I should have known better. Dinner started normally enough. Football played quietly from the living room television. The table overflowed with food. My mother smiled more than usual. Even Rachel seemed calm. For almost 30 minutes, everything felt surprisingly pleasant. Then the conversation shifted. One of Rachel's friends had recently gotten engaged. My mother commented on it. Rachel immediately turned toward me. "So, Emily," she said, smiling in that way she always did when trouble was coming. "Still single?" I shrugged. "Still happy." A few people laughed. Rachel didn't. "You know," she said, taking a sip of wine, "at some point, happiness isn't the issue." I knew where this was heading. I had heard versions of this speech for years. You ever think maybe nobody wants to spend their life with someone who's always acting like a soldier? The table became quiet. I kept my voice calm. "I've been a soldier for 18 years. "Exactly." My father chuckled. Rachel leaned back in her chair. Maybe men don't want someone giving orders all the time. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. I could have argued. I could have defended myself. Instead, I reached for my water glass. That irritated Rachel even more. She always wanted reactions. Silence frustrated her. You think you're better than everyone because you wear a uniform. I slowly looked at her. No. Then why do you always act so superior? I don't. The answer was simple, honest, and apparently unforgivable. Rachel stood so quickly her chair scraped across the hardwood floor. You know what your problem is. I didn't answer. The slap came without warning. The crack echoed through the dining room. My cheek exploded with pain. For several seconds, nobody moved. I remember hearing the ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant television, the sound of my own breathing. Rachel's chest rose and fell rapidly. She looked almost proud of herself. I waited. Surely somebody would say something. My mother, my father, anybody. Then my father pushed back his chair. For one brief moment, I thought he was standing up for me. I was wrong. He pointed toward the front door. Get out! I stared at him. What? You heard me. Dad, no, I've had enough of your attitude. My attitude. Not the slap. Not the humiliation. My attitude. You upset everyone every time you come here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rachel folded her arms. A smug smile spread across her face. My mother remained silent. The silence hurt more than the slap. Then came the sentence I will never forget. Don't ever come back. Nobody stopped him. Nobody defended me. Nobody even looked embarrassed. So I stood. I picked up my coat. And I walked toward the door. Outside, the freezing air hit my face like a wave. Snowflakes drifted through the darkness. The porch light glowed behind me. I reached my truck, opened the driver's door, and sat there for a long time. Not crying. Not angry. Just finished. 18 years. Thousands of sacrifices. Millions of dollars. And this was how it ended. Eventually, I pulled out my phone. Then my laptop. I logged into a secure folder. The documents appeared one by one. Property deed, vehicle titles, insurance policies, trust agreements, every signature, every record, every asset, all legally mine. I stared at the screen. Then I called my attorney. He answered on the second ring. Emily. I looked back at the house glowing warmly against the snow. The house I paid for. The house I'd just been thrown out of. Good evening, David. A pause. Then he heard something in my voice. What happened? I watched the snow falling across the windshield, and finally said the words that would change everything. It's time. David had represented me for nearly 12 years. He wasn't the kind of attorney who dramatized situations. He didn't panic. He didn't exaggerate. He simply listened, gathered facts, and acted. That was exactly why I trusted him. When I told him what had happened at Thanksgiving dinner, there was a long silence on the line. Finally, he asked one question. Are you absolutely certain? I knew what he meant. Not whether the slap had happened. Not whether my father had thrown me out. He was asking whether I was finally ready to stop protecting people who had spent years taking advantage of me. I looked back at the house one last time. The lights glowed warmly behind the curtains. Inside, they were probably finishing dessert. Probably laughing again. Probably congratulating themselves for putting Emily in her place. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt. No, I said quietly. I'm not changing my mind. David exhaled. Then we start first thing in the morning. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. I barely slept. Not because I was upset. Oddly enough, I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes after a difficult decision has finally been made. For years, I had carried a weight I refused to acknowledge. I kept telling myself things would improve. That my family would eventually appreciate what I'd done. That one day my father would say thank you. That one day Rachel would grow up. That one day my mother would stop pretending not to see what was happening. But some people never change. The sun hadn't fully risen when David's office began sending documents. Not emotional messages, not threats, not revenge. Facts. Legal notices, contract terminations, ownership confirmations. Every single action had been prepared years earlier. Because despite everything, I had always been careful. The house wasn't a gift. Legally, it never had been. The vehicles weren't gifts. The insurance policies weren't gifts. The arrangement existed because I allowed it to exist. And that arrangement was now ending. Around 8 o'clock that morning, my father received the first email. I know because he called me 15 minutes later. The phone rang while I was sitting in a small diner drinking coffee. His name appeared on the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Instead I answered, "What the hell is this?" he shouted immediately. No greeting. No apology. No acknowledgement of the night before. Just anger. I stirred my coffee slowly. "What are you referring to?" "The notice." "What notice?" "The damn house notice." I could almost picture him standing in the kitchen, red-faced, confused, outraged. For years he had believed the house belonged to him. Now reality had arrived. "The one explaining ownership?" I asked. Silence. Then more shouting. "You can't do this." "I can. This is our home." "No," I replied. "It's my home." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. For the first time, I think he realized I wasn't bluffing. Then he switched tactics. "You're overreacting." I nearly laughed. A strange thing happens when people lose control. They suddenly become experts in moderation. They commit the offense. Then they tell you your response is too extreme. "Am I asked?" "It was one argument." "It wasn't one argument. You know what I mean." "No," I said. "Actually, I don't." He became quiet. I continued. "It wasn't one argument. It wasn't one slap. It wasn't one holiday. It was 18 years. His breathing grew heavier. Then he said something that perfectly summarized our relationship. "You owe this family." I closed my eyes. There it was. The belief that had fueled everything. Not gratitude. Not appreciation. Entitlement. I owe this family. Not thank you for buying the house. Not thank you for paying the taxes. Not thank you for helping us survive. I owe them. The realization felt strangely liberating. "No," I said calmly. "I don't." Then I hung up. The next few hours became increasingly chaotic. By noon, every member of my family had learned the truth, or at least part of it. Rachel called first. 5 times. I ignored every call. Then came the text messages. "What is going on?" "Call me. Dad says this is a misunderstanding. Stop being dramatic." That last message almost made me smile. Dramatic? The woman who slapped me at Thanksgiving was accusing me of being dramatic. A few minutes later, my mother called. Unlike my father, she sounded frightened. "Emily," I hadn't heard uncertainty in her voice for years. "Yes." "Your father says the house—" "It belongs to me." She didn't respond immediately. "Since when?" I stared out the diner window. Snow covered the sidewalks. People hurried through the cold carrying shopping bags. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, my family was discovering the foundation beneath their lives had never been what they believed. "Since 15 years ago." Another silence. "You never told us." That statement surprised me. Not because it was inaccurate, because it ignored reality. I had told them, more than once. They simply never listened. Years earlier, when documents needed signatures, I'd explained everything. When insurance paperwork arrived, I'd explained everything. When tax forms appeared, I'd explained everything. But they never paid attention. They assumed details didn't matter. Now details mattered very much. "I did tell you." Her voice grew smaller. "Oh." That single word carried more weight than an entire conversation. Because deep down, she knew I was right. By mid-afternoon, David called with updates. Everything was proceeding exactly as expected. The property occupancy agreement had been terminated. Vehicle usage permissions were being revoked. Insurance coverage would end according to schedule. Every action complied fully with state law. No shortcuts. No loopholes. No revenge tactics. Just ownership rights. As the day continued, memories surfaced unexpectedly. Moments I hadn't thought about in years. The Christmas I spent overseas while paying for repairs on their house. The birthday I missed because my father needed help covering a financial mistake. The vacation I canceled because Rachel couldn't pay rent. Thousands of small sacrifices. Thousands of little choices. Each one made out of love. Or what I believed was love. Now I wondered whether it had actually been obligation. Late that afternoon, my cousin Megan called. Unlike most relatives, Megan had always treated me fairly. "Emily," she said carefully, "is this really happening?" "Yes." I just got off the phone with Rachel. I could imagine how that conversation went. Rachel crying. Rachel playing victim. Rachel rewriting history. Megan sighed. They genuinely thought everything belonged to them. The statement struck me harder than I expected. Because she was right. Not pretending. Not manipulating. Actually believing it. Years of comfort had convinced them that generosity was ownership. That dependence was entitlement. That support was permanent. By evening, the panic inside my parents' house had become impossible to ignore. I learned later that Rachel spent hours searching through filing cabinets looking for proof that the property belonged to them. There wasn't any. Because it didn't. My father called 3 more times. Each conversation grew angrier. Each conversation revealed more desperation. Finally, just before sunset, he reached me again. "What do you want?" he demanded. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was difficult. Because the answer was so simple. I wanted respect. Silence. I wanted basic decency. More silence. I wanted my family. His voice softened slightly, for the first time all day. Then he said something that removed any remaining doubt. "So you're really going to do this over hurt feelings?" I closed my eyes. After everything. After 18 years. After the slap. After being thrown out. After all the sacrifices. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about feelings. It wasn't. This was about consequences, and consequences had finally arrived. I looked out at the darkening sky, then answered quietly, "I'm doing exactly what you told me to do." "What?" "You told me to leave." A long pause followed. Then I delivered the sentence that finally ended the conversation. "You said never come back." And for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, my father had absolutely nothing to say. The first week after Thanksgiving felt less like a family dispute and more like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Not because I was actively trying to destroy anyone. I wasn't. In fact, most of my days remained surprisingly ordinary. I went back to work. I attended meetings. I reviewed reports. I exercised before dawn. Life continued. The difference was that I had stopped carrying other people on my back, and apparently my family had forgotten how to stand on their own. The first major shock arrived 3 days after Thanksgiving. The SUV my father had driven for nearly 8 years was collected by a recovery service. Legally. Professionally. Exactly as outlined in the paperwork. My father was furious. According to several relatives, he stood in the driveway screaming while the vehicle was loaded onto a transport truck. The neighbors watched from their windows. For years, he had proudly referred to it as his vehicle. Now he was discovering otherwise. The second vehicle disappeared the following afternoon. My mother's sedan. The same car she drove to church every Sunday. The same car she'd used to visit friends, go shopping, and attend family events. She cried when it left. That part bothered me more than I expected. Not because I regretted my decision. Because my mother had always been the complicated one. She wasn't cruel the way Rachel could be. She wasn't aggressive like my father. Her greatest flaw was silence. She watched injustice happen and convinced herself that avoiding conflict made her innocent. It didn't. But it made everything more complicated. 3 days later, another reality arrived. The automatic payments stopped. No more vehicle insurance. No more supplemental utility assistance. No more emergency household account. No more quiet financial safety net. For years, I had been covering expenses they barely noticed. Now those expenses suddenly became visible. The phone started ringing constantly. Not from my parents, from relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins. People who had never once asked how I was doing suddenly felt compelled to offer opinions. Most conversations followed the same pattern. "Maybe you've made your point." Or, "They're family." Or my personal favorite, "You only get one father." Funny how nobody ever said, "You only get one daughter." One afternoon while driving back from the base, I received a call from my Aunt Linda. She had always considered herself the unofficial referee of family conflicts. "Emily," she began carefully, "don't you think this has gone far enough?" I smiled despite myself. How far is far enough? A pause. "Well, no really." She struggled to answer, because there wasn't an answer. Everyone wanted forgiveness. Nobody wanted accountability. Finally, she sighed. "Your father is under a lot of stress." I nearly laughed. For 18 years, I'd watched my father's stress become everyone else's responsibility. The bills, the mistakes, the consequences. Someone else always absorbed the impact. Usually me. I was under a lot of stress when he threw me out. Linda became quiet. Eventually, she changed the subject. "That happened often. Truth makes people uncomfortable, especially when they're accustomed to benefiting from lies." But the real explosion came the following week. Rachel showed up at my house. I hadn't spoken to her since Thanksgiving. I honestly hadn't planned to. The doorbell rang shortly after noon on a Saturday. I wasn't expecting visitors. When I opened the door, Rachel stood on the porch. For a moment, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked different physically. Because her confidence was gone. Gone was the smug smile. Gone was the superiority. Gone was the certainty that somebody else would solve her problems. Her eyes were red. Her makeup was smeared. And for the first time in her life, she looked scared. "What do you want?" I asked. She pushed past me before I could stop her. Typical Rachel. Boundaries had never meant much to her. She marched into the living room, then turned around. "You've lost your mind." I closed the door. "No." "You're destroying Mom and Dad." "No." "Then what do you call this?" I folded my arms. "The consequences of their actions." Her face twisted with frustration. It was one argument. There it was. The family narrative. Reduce everything. Minimize everything. Pretend the final event is the only event. It wasn't one argument. "Emily." It wasn't one argument. My voice remained calm. Years in the army had taught me something important. The calmest person usually controls the room. Rachel hated that. "You got slapped." She threw her hands into the air. "So what?" I stared at her. She realized what she'd said only after the words left her mouth. But it was too late. "So what?" Not "I'm sorry." Not "I was wrong." "So what?" Years of entitlement condensed into 2 words. I slowly nodded. "Thank you." Her forehead wrinkled. "For what?" "For finally being honest." Rachel looked confused. I continued. "Because that's exactly the problem." "What?" "You think hurting people doesn't matter." Her mouth opened, then closed. For once she had no comeback. The silence stretched between us. Then something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced. One I hadn't thought about in years. My 18th birthday. I had received acceptance paperwork for military training. I remember sitting at the kitchen table excited and terrified. My father barely looked at it. Rachel had just gotten into trouble again. The entire evening revolved around her. Not me. Her. Then another memory. My first deployment. Nobody came to the airport. Rachel needed help moving apartments. My parents chose that instead. Then another. And another. And another. Thousands of moments. Not dramatic enough to tell stories about individually. But together they formed a pattern. A lifetime of being second. Rachel interrupted my thoughts. "You're being cruel." That almost made me laugh. Cruel. The woman who slapped me. The family who threw me out. The people who spent years benefiting from my sacrifices. Now I was cruel. "No, Rachel." I looked directly into her eyes. "For the first time in my life, I'm simply stopping." She stared at me. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done rescuing people who wouldn't rescue me." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then her expression changed. Fear replaced anger. Real fear. The kind that appears when someone realizes the safety net is gone. I can't afford this. There it was. The truth. Not guilt. Not regret. Money. I waited. Eventually, she continued. "The apartment account." I blinked. "What about it?" Her face paled. "The emergency account." I had almost forgotten about it. Years earlier, I'd created a separate fund for family emergencies. Medical bills. Unexpected repairs. Temporary assistance. Rachel had quietly treated it like a personal backup account for years. David had closed access after Thanksgiving. Legally. Appropriately. Immediately. "You closed it." "Yes." She sat down heavily, as if her legs suddenly couldn't support her weight. For the first time, I saw genuine panic. Not performance. Not manipulation. Panic. Because Rachel was finally confronting adulthood. No backup. No rescue. No Emily. Just consequences. She looked up, and for a brief moment I thought she might apologize. Instead, she whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" The answer came easily. Because most adults already know it. Work. Her eyes filled with tears, and suddenly she began crying. Not quietly. Not gracefully. Full body sobs. Years of dependence crashing into reality. I watched silently. Not out of cruelty. Out of acceptance. Some lessons cannot be taught. They must be lived. Eventually she left. The front door closed behind her, and the house became quiet again. That night I sat alone on my back porch watching snow drift across the yard. The air was cold. The stars were bright. For the first time in years I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Then my phone vibrated. A text message. From my mother. Only 4 words. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Something about the message felt different. Not demanding. Not manipulative. Not defensive. Just tired. Very tired. And deep down I knew something had changed. Because for the first time since Thanksgiving, my mother wasn't contacting me because she wanted money. She was contacting me because the illusion had finally collapsed. I didn't answer my mother's text immediately. Not because I wanted to punish her. Not because I wanted her to worry. I simply needed time. For most of my life, every conversation with my family followed the same pattern. Something happened. Someone hurt me. I absorbed it. Then I moved on. That cycle had repeated so many times that it felt normal. But normal wasn't always healthy. Sometimes normal was just another word for tolerated. The text sat on my phone for nearly 24 hours before I finally replied. When I did, my message was simple. When and where? Her response came almost immediately. Tomorrow, noon, Maple Grove Cafe. Just us. I wasn't sure I believed that last part. As it turned out, I was right not to. The following afternoon, I arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe sat on the edge of town beside a frozen pond. It was one of those quiet places older couples liked. Warm lighting, wooden tables, the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon. The kind of place where people spoke softly. The kind of place where family arguments looked completely out of place. Yet the moment I walked inside, I saw all three of them. My mother, my father, Rachel, waiting together. I stopped for a moment, not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. Part of me had expected this. My father sat rigidly in his chair. Rachel looked exhausted. My mother looked older, much older, not physically, emotionally. The past 2 weeks had clearly taken a toll. I approached the table. Nobody spoke. Finally, I sat down. The silence stretched long enough for a waitress to appear and take drink orders. Only after she left did my father speak. You tricked us. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. The man had somehow transformed himself into the victim again. No. His jaw tightened. You hid everything. I didn't hide anything. Then why didn't we know? The answer arrived immediately. Because you never listened. But I didn't say it yet. Instead, I opened the leather folder I'd brought with me. A thick stack of documents rested inside. Paper has a strange effect on people. Opinions can be debated. Facts are harder to argue with. I slid the first document across the table. The property deed. My name sat clearly at the top. Owner Emily Carter. Rachel stared. My mother stared. My father looked away. I placed another document on the table. Property tax records. 15 years. Every payment. Every receipt. Every dollar. My name. Then another. Insurance records. Then another. Mortgage history. Then another. Repair invoices. The pile grew larger. The silence grew heavier. Eventually, my mother picked up one of the pages. Her hands trembled slightly. These are all yours. Yes. She turned another page. And another. And another. Her eyes widened. Because for the first time, she wasn't hearing estimates or assumptions. She was seeing numbers. Real numbers. The roof replacement. $22,000. The furnace replacement. $9,000. Foundation repairs. $16,000. Property taxes, year after year after year. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. My father shifted uncomfortably. Rachel looked stunned. And suddenly I understood something. They had never actually wanted to know. Knowing would have required gratitude. Knowing would have required responsibility. It was easier not to ask. Easier not to think about where everything came from. My mother finally looked up. Emily, the word barely escaped her lips. I continued before anyone else could speak. You know what the hardest part is? Nobody answered. The money doesn't bother me. That surprised them. I could see it. Rachel blinked. My father frowned. My mother stared. I leaned back in my chair. The money was never the point. The waitress arrived with coffee. Nobody touched it. I continued. The hardest part is that none of you ever cared enough to ask. The words settled over the table. Heavy. Unavoidable. For years I had hidden behind military discipline. Work harder. Stay calm. Move forward. But now there was nowhere left to hide. I looked at Rachel. Do you know how many birthdays I spent overseas? She looked down. I looked at my mother. Do you know how many holidays I missed? Tears appeared in her eyes. Then I looked at my father. Do you know how many times I sent money home instead of spending it on myself? He remained silent. The silence answered everything. Number? They didn't know. Because they never asked. My mother's shoulders began to shake, small at first, then harder. Tears rolled down her cheeks. The sight startled me. My mother rarely cried. Not in public. Not in front of people. Not ever. I didn't know. Her voice cracked. For years I had imagined hearing those words. I thought they would feel satisfying. Instead, they felt sad. Deeply sad. Because she was telling the truth. She genuinely hadn't known. Not because the information was hidden. Because she never looked. And now she was seeing nearly 20 years of reality all at once. The weight of it seemed almost unbearable. Rachel stared at the paperwork. Then something caught her attention. One specific set of documents. She picked them up slowly. Her face turned pale. No. I already knew what she'd found. College tuition payments. Every semester. Every year. Every transfer. My name. Not my parents'. Mine. She flipped through them frantically, then found another file. Her first apartment deposit. My name. Another. Credit card debt settlement. My name. Another. Emergency medical expenses. My name. The color drained from her face. She looked genuinely shocked. For the first time in her life, Rachel was confronting the truth. Much of the stability she'd taken for granted had come from me. Not our parents. Not luck. Me. I thought Mom and Dad paid for this. Her voice sounded small. Almost childlike. I met her eyes. They couldn't. The realization hit her hard. I could see it. Years of assumptions collapsing. Years of stories rewritten in seconds. For the first time, Rachel wasn't angry. She was ashamed. The feeling seemed unfamiliar to her. My mother wiped her eyes. Rachel stared at the table. And then everyone looked at my father. Because there was only one person left who hadn't spoken honestly. He sat motionless, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. Pride wrapped around him like armor. Finally he spoke, and somehow managed to make everything worse. You still shouldn't have done this. The words landed with a dull thud. My mother closed her eyes. Rachel looked horrified. Even the waitress seemed uncomfortable as she passed nearby. I stared at him. After everything. After the evidence. After the truth. After the tears. That was his response. Not, I'm sorry. Not, thank you. Not, I was wrong. You still shouldn't have done this. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Because suddenly I understood something. My father wasn't refusing to apologize because he hated me. He was refusing because apologizing would destroy the image he had built of himself. If he admitted he was wrong, he'd have to confront decades of mistakes. Some people would rather lose everything than face themselves. He stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor. I'm leaving. Nobody stopped him. Not even my mother. He walked toward the exit, then disappeared through the door. The bell above it jingled softly, and just like that he was gone. The three of us sat there in silence. Finally Rachel spoke. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. Everything was gone. I didn't know. A tear rolled down her cheek. Then another. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air. Simple. Late. But real. I believed her. Not because she deserved instant forgiveness. Because for the first time she sounded honest. My mother reached across the table. Carefully. As if afraid I might pull away. I'm sorry too. I looked at both of them. Then out the window. Snow drifted across the frozen pond. The world looked peaceful. Still. Quiet. For the first time since Thanksgiving, something inside me loosened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. The meeting ended shortly afterward. We walked outside together. The cold air wrapped around us. My mother hugged me before leaving. Rachel hesitated. Then hugged me too. Neither gesture erased the past. But it felt like a beginning. As I watched them drive away in a borrowed vehicle, one thought lingered in my mind. My mother was changing. Rachel was changing. But my father wasn't. And deep down, I knew the final chapter of this story would belong to him. Winter settled over North Carolina with a quiet determination that year. The holidays passed. Then January. Then February. Life moved forward the way it always does. Not dramatically. Not all at once. One day at a time. Looking back, that's what surprised me most. For years, I had imagined that if I ever stopped supporting my family, everything would collapse overnight. It didn't. The world kept turning. People adapted. They always do. The first few weeks were ugly. There were arguments, tension, resentment. More than one angry phone call from extended relatives, but eventually reality settled in. And reality has a way of forcing change. Rachel found a job. An actual full-time job. Not something temporary. Not another half-hearted attempt she could abandon after a month. A real job. The first time she told me about it, she sounded almost embarrassed. We were talking on the phone one evening. The relationship between us remained cautious, fragile, like a bridge being rebuilt after years of neglect. I started work Monday. I smiled. How was it? She groaned. My feet hurt. I laughed. For the first time in months, she laughed too. Then she said something I never expected to hear. I should have done this years ago. The honesty caught me off guard. Because she was right. She should have. But people grow at different speeds. Some lessons arrive late. What matters is whether they arrive at all. My mother changed too. In many ways, her transformation was even more significant. For decades, she had lived in the space between conflict and silence. Whenever tension appeared, she retreated. Whenever someone behaved badly, she looked away. Not because she was cruel, because she was afraid. Afraid of arguments, afraid of upsetting people, afraid of confronting difficult truths. But age has a way of stripping away illusions. Once she saw everything clearly, she couldn't unsee it. She started calling regularly, not to ask for money, not to ask for favors, just to talk. At first, the conversations felt awkward. We were learning how to be mother and daughter again, learning how to have a relationship without obligations hanging over every interaction. One evening, she said something that stayed with me. I spent so many years keeping the peace that I forgot peace and silence aren't the same thing. I sat quietly after she said it. Because it was true. Silence had cost all of us more than we realized. The house situation resolved itself shortly afterward. David handled everything professionally. My parents eventually moved into a smaller rental property. Modest, comfortable, affordable. For the first time in years, they were living within their actual means, not within mine. And despite all the drama, something unexpected happened. They survived. The world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. They adjusted, which only reinforced something I'd been learning throughout this entire ordeal. People are often far stronger than they pretend to be. Sometimes dependence becomes a habit, not a necessity. But one person refused to change. My father. At first, he doubled down. He blamed me. He blamed lawyers. He blamed paperwork. He blamed circumstances, everyone except himself. Months passed without meaningful contact. Occasionally, I heard updates through relatives. He was angry, still convinced he had been wronged, still refusing responsibility. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything different. And strangely enough, that brought peace. One of the hardest lessons adulthood teaches is that not everyone gets a redemption arc. Some people choose pride over healing, again and again, no matter the cost. By early spring, nearly 4 months had passed since Thanksgiving. The snow had disappeared. Trees were beginning to bloom. The air felt lighter. One Saturday afternoon, I was working in my backyard when I heard a vehicle pull into the driveway. I looked up. A pickup truck sat near the curb. The driver remained inside for several seconds. Then the door opened. My father stepped out. For a moment, I simply stared. Because he looked different. Older. Not physically older. Life older. The kind of aging that happens when reality finally catches up. His shoulders seemed lower, his movement slower, his confidence diminished. I set down my gardening gloves. Neither of us spoke as he approached. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the silence felt enormous. I waited. So did he. The man who had never struggled to express anger now seemed unable to find words. Finally, he looked away, then back at me, and quietly said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I wanted to make him suffer, because I genuinely wasn't sure I would ever hear those words. The wind moved softly through the trees. Birds chirped somewhere nearby. The world felt strangely still. My father swallowed, then continued. I was wrong. Just 4 words. 4 simple words, yet they carried more weight than any speech. More weight than any excuse. More weight than any explanation. Because for the first time in my life, my father wasn't defending himself. He wasn't blaming someone else. He wasn't rewriting history. He was telling the truth. I studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion, the regret. And suddenly I realized something important. The punishment had never been losing the house, or the cars, or the money. The punishment had been seeing himself clearly, maybe for the first time. His voice cracked slightly. I should have protected you that night. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not resentment. Grief. The grief of hearing the right words years too late. You should have. He nodded. A tear appeared in his eye. The sight stunned me. I had seen my father angry, proud, frustrated, determined. I had never seen him cry. I failed you. The words barely escaped his lips. And in that moment, I believed him. Not because he suddenly became a perfect man. Not because everything was fixed. But because truth finally stood between us, naked and unavoidable. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I stepped forward and hugged him. Not because the past disappeared. Not because the pain vanished. But because carrying hatred forever is another kind of prison. Eventually, we pulled apart. Neither of us said much afterward. We didn't need to. Some conversations happen without words. As he walked back toward his truck, he paused, then turned around. Thank you. The words sounded strange coming from him. Unfamiliar, but genuine. I watched him drive away, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt completely at peace. People often assume this story is about revenge. It's not. At least not really. Revenge is about hurting someone. What happened here was different. I simply stopped allowing people to benefit from my sacrifices while disrespecting my existence. I stopped confusing love with obligation. I stopped believing that families should receive unlimited chances regardless of their behavior. Most importantly, I learned something many people spend their entire lives trying to understand. Boundaries are not cruelty. Self-respect is not selfishness. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is allow consequences to teach lessons that kindness never could. That Thanksgiving night, my family threw me out of a house they believed was theirs. By sunrise, they were discovering the truth. I didn't take anything that belonged to them. I simply reclaimed what belonged to me. And in doing so, I gave all of us something we never had before: honesty. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved? Have you ever been forced to choose between keeping the peace and respecting yourself? Leave a comment below and share your story. And wherever you're watching from today, let me know. I always enjoy hearing from you. We have many more powerful stories to share, so subscribe and join us on this journey. You never know which story might remind you that your strength is greater than you think.